Lesson number 3, Phrasing and Semantic Function, James 1, verses 16, 17, and 18. Class, you can see that I have phrased out this passage, and I've also included my estimation of these functions. Let me just say a word on these functions. As you read the categories, you might see one of these categories differently than I see them, and that's okay. The purpose of this exercise is that you begin to look at that Greek text and you begin to form in your mind, what is the author trying to say here? Remember, the first rule of hermeneutics is, what is the author's intent for the original hearer? So phrasing forces you to do that. It forces you to look at your passage, try to understand what the author is saying to his original hearers, because that's where we begin the exegetical process. So as we look at this, let's just look at the passage real quickly. I've included the PDF again in Blackboard that has the English under the Greek, if that helps you. But you can retrieve that there. But verse 16, James says, "Do not be deceived, my beloved brothers." Okay, it's a command. Or be not deceived, my beloved brothers. You can see that command right here. And get my pointer there. There's your command, and then the vocative, adelphoi mu agapetoi. Okay, so that's your vocative of address. So he is continuing his argument from our last lesson about the nature of God. God does not tempt us. Okay, all the temptation comes from what's in us and our nature, not in the nature of God. So I see James as continuing his argument here about the nature of God. So it's a continuous passage. If you think about it, you could even put these two sections together in one really nice sermon. Although I think once you begin to unpack it exegetically, you're going to need a couple of times to preach this passage. Anyway, that's up to you and for the setting that you're in, for you to determine that. Okay, so we have a commandment in verse 16. In verse 17, we have some assertions. Look at assertion 1. Every good and every perfect gift is from above. Okay? So I broke it down. Every good gift, okay? And then I came below, every perfect gift. All right? Now, you probably see there's some different ways that you can actually translate that over in lesson 2. Looking there on, see if I can find the footnote that it's on. At least I thought I had that in there. There are a couple different ways you can translate that. Okay, I think, let's see, from the following, every good gift and every perfect gift. There is an alternate way to translate this, and I think this is interesting that that some have said every good act of giving, okay, and every perfect gift. It's the act of giving is taking into account the dosis here, okay, and it's the idea is that James is trying to say the very act of God's giving is to give us good things, and what he gives us are perfect gifts. They're complete, teleon. and they are from above. They're from heaven. So you have two assertions there. And then notice what I did with this participle. I brought it down. Now you could leave it up here beside Eston if you wanted to. But I chose to bring it down, and here's why. Because that participle is the participle katabinon, coming down, literally. It's coming from the source. It's coming from the God of lights. So I chose to set it off there separately. Now, you don't have to do it that way. You could leave that participle right up there, but I like the way James is using the participle to set it off. The good gift is he is above anothen, and he uses the participle coming down, showing that from heaven God is giving us these things. He's the giver of good gifts, and he's giving good gifts, perfect gifts. So I chose to set it off there. Now you could do it a couple of different ways, but I set it off, and then I put two items under the prepositional phrases. Really, I put them under the coming down. So I call this apa, a source. We know that apa is showing the source of something, that pronoun. So it's coming down from the Father of lights. That's the source of these gifts. And then look at the description. Now he's describing not the gift, but the giver. All right? From whom, okay, there's your there's your relative pronoun. From whom, and you'd have to supply there is not, okay, that's the verb of being is supplied there. From whom there is not even one change. There is not one paralange. There's not one change, or, see the or there, there's not one change, or there's not one change, or it's kind of difficult to translate this. It's unwavering variation, or could be shadow of turning. Look down there at footnote 10 in your notes. Is trophes, the turning, the change of the variation, and then aposchisma is the darkness. Now, if you'll remember, there's a hymn in our hymn books. It's called "Great is Thy Faithfulness." And man, this would be a great hymn to sing if you're preaching this passage. But there's this line in that hymn: "Great is Thy faithfulness, O God my Father, there is no shadow of turning with Thee." Now that hymn was inspired by this passage of Scripture, and it's a little difficult to translate, but what he's trying to say is there's no wavering variation. There's no shadow of turning. Okay, there's not one variation, no shadow of turning. He just does not have darkness. There's nothing to eclipse his glory, nothing to eclipse his goodness. In fact, if you go on in that hymn, he says, "There's no shadow of turning with Thee. Thou changest not. Thy compassions, they fail not. As Thou hast been, Thou forever will be." Okay, great is Thy faithfulness, great is Thy faithfulness. Morning by morning, new mercies I see. Well, you see how the writer's inspired by this caricature of God as light. He's the Father of light, and there's no turning darkness in Him at all. Okay? There's no shifting. There's not one variation of shifting in his character. So we're talking about the nature of God here, and you could again bring in your systematic theology on the nature of God and have a powerful, powerful sermon. Preach some good doctrine to your folks. Okay, now let's look at verse 18 because we have to move on to that. In verse 18, it begins with a participle, and having willed. Now, why did I indent that there? If you go back and look in Mounts, he says, maintain the Greek text word order as much as possible. And if you have a participle that is, it's actually an adverbial participle modifying the main clause right here, it comes first, so you indent it above. And I called this a purpose because he having willed. It's his purpose that he's giving these gifts, right? And he gives these gifts, and we're going to see the greatest gift, of course, is salvation, which is coming up in this passage right here. So, having willed, here's your third assertion. He brought us forth in word of truth, or in the word of truth, we would say in English. All right? So he brought us forth. He birthed us. Do you see the comparison here? You've got this talking about birthing sin. You know, our lust births sin, and it gives, you know, it conceives and it gives birth to sin. But God gives a different kind of birth. He's nowhere near like us. He brought us forth. He births us. Okay, he births us in the word of truth. His word is truth. It brings new life. And then here's a purpose infinitive right here. You have to go back and review your infinitives just a little bit. Remember, when you see ice, ta, and then the infinitive, it's going to be a causal or a purpose. And I translated it in order that we might be a kind of first fruits, first fruits, a sort of, you have to just sort of piece this together again, a sort of first fruits, okay, of his creation. All right, so let's hit that again. Having willed, he brought us forth in the word of truth, in order that, for the purpose of, that we might be made a kind of first fruit among his creation. Now, why would he say a kind of first fruit? Well, who is the first fruit? The Lord Jesus. So he tones it down with this tina, and he doesn't want to make us on par with Christ, but he's saying we are a kind of first fruits. I mean, Jesus was the first fruit of the resurrection. He was brought forth, and because of, remember the concept of first fruits, when the first fruit was brought, the farmer would look at the seed, and that was the promise that the rest of the harvest would also follow. And so, as Jesus was the first fruit, we are a kind of first fruits of his creation. So, beautiful, beautiful passage that you can pull together in a great message. And so let's look at my little outline here. I took my title from that first main clause, don't be deceived by God's nature, okay? And I sort of lumped it in with here, well, point number one is don't misconstrue God's nature. He gives gifts. He doesn't give evil things. Like the lesson 1, we learned that there in verses 13 to 15. So he gives gifts. Well, what sort of gifts does he give? And I went ahead and brought this down as another category. Well, he gives good gifts. Look up there. Every good gift Okay, God gives good gifts, not evil gifts. But he gives something else. He gives a perfect gift. All right? God gives perfect gifts. There's no one who can compare. No other gift can compare to his gift. Okay? Or his gifts. All right, what is the source of his gifts? I kept kind of the alliteration there. The sort of gifts and the source of gifts. Well, it's from the Father above. Okay? He's the Father of lights. Here's the Father of lights. And he's the Father who does not change. He's immutable. You know, the characteristic of God. That is, there's no variation and there's no turning or shadow of darkness. Then I brought my second point is that he wills, having willed. I keyed off that participle. There's a reason James put it first. Since word order doesn't matter, why would he put the participle first? I think because he's emphasizing the will of God. So he puts that first. Having willed, okay, so God's desire is to make man new. That's the greatest gift. He gives all these other gifts, but the greatest gift is new life. So here's your main clause for point number 2. And we see that he brought us forth in the word of truth. All right, so I took that, and I just kind of pulled the whole thing together. God's desire is to give us new birth, or to make us new. Okay, so his will is to give us new birth. He brought us forth. There's the birth language in the word of truth. I went ahead and I didn't want to leave that statement out. So his truth, his word is truth, and we're born again by the word of truth. And the third point is he wants to make us new creatures. Now you could tie this in with some subpoints from 2 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians 5. We're born again. Boy, I mean, you could go to John 3. You could tie in Paul. You could tie in Jesus here, and just have a fantastic sermon. And so there you have it. That's our Greek text, and we've laid out a biblical expositional sermon there, and you can pull in your other illustrations and so forth. You have a great passage here for a great, powerful sermon.